interested in that, we need to have Don come back for the Howie Morenz story, and he can bring his books and sell them to us. That'll be his prize. So we're going to jump ahead a century into the area of the business of hockey. Our next speaker is Kenneth Thornicoft, who is a professor of law and employment relations at the University of Victoria's Peter B. Gustafson School of Business. Professor Thornicoft holds a law degree from UBC and a doctorate from Case Western. He's the author of over 170 articles and several textbooks on employment law and contract. Today he is presenting So You're Telling Me There's a Chance, a statistical analysis of professional tryout agreements, PTOs, in the National Hockey League from 2015 to 2022.
Okay.
We're going to vent for a few minutes while John gets straightened out.
Okay, we're good to go. So if we weren't in professional sports and we were just an organization and we wanted to sort of test out whether an employee would be someone we would really like to bring into our organization, we would hire them on a probationary contract. So you've probably heard that phrase, I'm a probationary employee, or I'm on probation. I know there's a criminal lawyer in the audience, a little different probation than that. But in the National Hockey League, the collective bargaining agreement allows for a kind of form of probation, and this is called the PTO, or the Professional Tryout Agreement. And there's sort of an interesting, if we can move one slide forward here. The PTO is sort of fitting into a number of provisions in the collective bargaining agreement that create sort of a demand for this professional tryout agreement. So some of you may know that teams have a reserve list which is capped at 90 players, which would include players that they've drafted that they haven't signed, players that have been drafted and have signed, as well as their roster of players. And there's a maximum number of contracts that a team can have at any one time. There are some exemptions and exceptions in the collective bargaining agreement, but basically it's capped at 50. So that would allow for a team to fill out a professional roster in the National Hockey League, and then in the minor league, it's typically going to be the American Hockey League, although sometimes it could be the ECHL as well. So you're sort of limited to these 50 contracts, but what's not included in the 50 contract, if we can just skip ahead one slide, are these PTOs. The actual form of the PTO is actually set out in the collective bargaining agreement itself. It's a very simple and straightforward agreement, and sort of the long and the short of it is you're on probation, not just with the team that has signed you to the PTO, but also to any other professional hockey team as well, because having signed a PTO, or the team, I should say, having signed a player to a PTO, that doesn't count against their reserve list. So, you know, they're free from that 90-player limit in the reserve list. And it's sort of an interesting agreement because the player does not receive any compensation for this. So normally, if you're just a probationary employee, you're working for, you know, Canadian Tire or something, you would be paid for your work. Here, you don't receive any compensation whatsoever. Anything I have in quotes is actually a direct quote from the form of the contract, which is actually in the CBA. So you get your round-trip travel expenses, so you get that. You get accommodation where the training camp is being held, and per diem meals. You have your medical and dental costs covered with respect to any injury that you might suffer while you're with the team on the PTO. And if we want to just move to the next slide. And to me, this seems to be the biggest risk for the player, because as I'm sure you know, NHL contracts are guaranteed. So if I signed a 4-year contract, I'm going to be paid for all 4 years of that agreement, whether I perform at a high level, whether I'm injured. Now, there are some limited exceptions whereby that contract can be terminated. The most common, of course, is a buyout. And in a buyout, the player still receives a certain amount of compensation, and then they're allowed to be a free agent and sign with another team. But in terms of the PTO, you're not receiving any compensation. And so there is a substantial risk to the player, because what happens if I get hurt? So the only benefit that's provided in regard to that is a $50,000 benefit, and only if you're permanently disabled. So if you suffer some sort of injury that's treatable, that doesn't result in a permanent disability, the medical costs associated with that would be covered. But beyond that, the maximum benefit is $50,000. So I would presume, and I don't know this for a fact, but I would presume that most players who are signing these PTOs are separately contracting with an insurance company for disability insurance of one kind or another. Certainly, if I were an agent acting for a player, I would want to make sure that that happens. And of course, that cost would be to the player. The team's not going to cover that. The other thing about the PTO is there's no security of tenure that's granted to the player. So the team can terminate that PTO at any time, and it automatically terminates when the season begins. So if you haven't been signed to a contract, then the PTO terminates, you're a free agent, you can go wherever you like. And actually, even during the term of the PTO, this is the one benefit to the player, you may not be signed by the team who has offered you the PTO, but you're free to sign with any club. So you do have that ability to sort of showcase your skills to the team, and typically players on PTOs will play, a number of preseason games, and then the team will make a decision as to whether or not they want to offer that player a contract or not. And if they don't, perhaps some other NHL team might, or some other professional team, and of course you would be free to sign at any point in time. So there's no sort of reciprocal obligations in terms of I'm subject to your reserve list, and the team has no obligation to that particular player. So if we can just skip forward. I know we're going to have a talk about Slapshot. This is not a hockey movie, but it's the closest I could get, because essentially the player is, well, just give me a chance. So can we run the clip? I think we need a little volume here.
Get more volume, Joe. Crank her up.
So for those of you at the back of the room that couldn't quite hear it, could we get together? And no, there are not really very good chances. He says, like, well, maybe 1 in 100. No, more like 1 in a million. And then he says, so you're telling me there's a chance? That's that. So we can move to the next slide.
You didn't marry her in real life.
That's right.
Can we move to the next slide? Okay, yeah, here we go. So it's actually, this data goes back to 2015, which is so far as I was able to determine, the 2015 was the first year that this data was sort of generally available. And as you can see, over the course of seasons up to and including last season, there's typically been about 30 or 40 PTOs that are signed in any particular year. And overall, the chances of securing a professional contract with an NHL team, and I'll talk a little bit more about the contracts in a moment, is about 1 in 5 over this series. So, you're telling me there's a chance. The chances actually aren't that bad. And when you look at the more recent experience, in 2021, 71% of the players who were signed to PTOs ended up signing with an NHL team. And in the last couple of seasons, it's a little bit north of 40%. So the odds are not too bad. Now, there's one outlier year, which is 2016-2017, where 195 PTOs were signed in that season, which is dramatically different, by a factor of 5 in some cases, relative to years coming later. And I don't really understand why there was such a spike in PTOs at the start of that season. I've tried to do some reading to find out if people have thoughts, and there's really not much to be said about that so far as I could gather. My theory is, and it's a relatively uninformed theory, but I'll throw it out there, and I'm sure many people in the audience are more knowledgeable than me about player movement and that sort of thing, but in the years prior to 2016, the salary cap was moving up quite significantly each year, usually 8 to 10%. And just before the start of this season, the NHL office, as they do every year, they advise the team saying, we think the salary cap will go up by X%, and then that allows the teams to budget for how many players are going to sign and at what salary levels and so forth. For that season, the salary cap, which had been generally going up by about 8 to 10%, the league had said it's probably only going to go up by 1 to 2%. So perhaps that had a depressive effect on signing players because teams didn't have very much room, or they were unwilling to commit. Remember what I said before, you sign a player, that contract's guaranteed. And we often see circumstances where teams get into trouble because they have players signed to high salaries that aren't performing at a level that's commensurate with the salary that they're earning. And there's not much that can be done about that. It's very, very hard, as I'm sure we all know, to move a contract in the NHL these days. It's not just you trade a player, because there's salary cap considerations for you, for the team that's going, you've got 50 contract limit, etc. So perhaps that had some impact as to why there was such a spike. And in recent years, you'll see that the success rate, so to speak, has been around 40%. And I suspect that reflects two things. One, teams are only offering PTOs to players who they believe have a realistic chance of cracking their lineup, either at the NHL level or at least at the minor league level. And from the player's point of view, there are risks as well, obviously the biggest one being a serious injury. So are you going to put yourself at risk if there's not a reasonable likelihood that you're going to be able to secure a contract? As the numbers in the far right side here show, most players that sign a contract, a standard player's contract, an SPC, they tend to sign with the team that signed them to the PTO itself. But as I said before, they're free to sign with any team in the league, and about 1 out of 5 of all players who sign an NHL contract actually sign with another team. If we can just move to the next slide. The numbering is very small here, but and I'm not going to go through this, but just to sort of demonstrate that there seems to be kind of a bimodal distribution in the league. Some teams are quite willing to use the PTO as a mechanism to identify players who they might bring into their sort of team family, and other teams don't use it very much at all. So I suppose it's an open question about, can you identify factors within particular teams that lead them to use PTOs, playoff success or salary cap considerations or whatever. So I'll just say that, and then we can move on to the next slide. I'm not going to get too statistical here, but these boldface numbers here, which I hope you can see at the back of the room, they show whether in a statistical sense there's a meaningful difference between players who are signed to a PTO, which over the course of time that I'm examining is 510 players, versus 114 who actually ended up signing a standard professional contract. And there are some interesting things here, I think, that pop out. So overall, the average age for players signing a PTO was 28 years, but players actually signing into an NHL contract are just a little bit over 30. So I think we tend to see players who are at sort of the back end of their career and have more experience. In terms of positions, wingers seem to be more likely to sign a contract than players in other positions. And when we look at the distinction between players who signed a PTO but didn't sign an NHL contract, they had, on average, 163 games of National Hockey League experience, whereas the players actually signing with an NHL team had 466 professional games. And in the immediately prior season, overall it was only 9 games played in the previous season, whereas players actually signing with an NHL team had almost 39 games the prior season. So if we can just move to the next slide. This just shows you the distribution by age. So each bar represents a 2-year age category starting at age 22. So you can just see by the distribution of the bars that most of the players trend to being older, and in fact, if you add up the numbers, 61% of the players who actually signed an NHL contract, they were between the ages of 26 and 31. So I suppose that reduces the risk for the team because the player has a track record of consistent performance, which is reflected in the number of games that they have played. And if their age is highly correlated with the number of games they've played. So if we just move to the next slide, you'll see that these bars here, each bar represents 100 games. And again, you can just sort of look at the distribution. 75% of the players who actually signed an NHL contract following the PTO had somewhere between 100 and 700 total games of NHL experience. So it definitely trends to players who are older and have more experience in the NHL. If we can just move to the next slide. This looks at the games the previous season, and you'll see it's a much sort of flatter distribution. So actually, a lot of the players didn't have very many games the previous season. And without going into each and every player and identifying the particular circumstances of them, it's sort of hard to speculate what the theme is. But partly it could be that they were playing in another league, perhaps in Europe. I think more likely they may well have been hurt the prior season, and so they didn't have an opportunity to play very many games. But again, most players had previous experience in the immediately prior season of about half the season, so giving a pretty good opportunity. If we can just move to the next, you've probably heard the phrase one-way and two-way contracts. Yeah. So the idea here is certain players can sign a one-way contract. In other words, even if they are assigned to the minors, and that's not as easy as you might think, because oftentimes when the player is assigned to the minors, they would have to clear waivers. In other words, every other team in the league would have an opportunity to select that player, and they would just assume whatever contractual obligation that player would otherwise have. So the American Hockey League is kind of interesting because on the same team you could have somebody who might be earning $70,000 or $80,000 a season, and you might have somebody making $4 million a season. And so that I guess we know who's paying for dinner when they're on the road. Conversely, you can have a two-way contract. So if you're in the NHL, you get paid one salary, and if you're in typically the American Hockey League, but it might be the ECHL as well, you get a different salary. And the gaps are often very, very significant. So for example, entry-level players, so they've been drafted, they sign their first entry-level contract. Typically for first and second round draft choices, their compensation is going to be give or take around $1 million a season, US, these are US funds. But their minor league salary is typically around $70,000 to $80,000. So the gaps can be, very, very significant. So in terms of these players that signed the PTO, 96.5% of the contracts that were signed were simply for one season. So, you can have a contract upwards of even 8 years, but virtually all of the contracts were for 1 year. I think that reflects the fact we go back, they're older players to begin with, and other research that's been done has sort of demonstrated, to a pretty good degree of mathematical certainty, that 27 seems to be the tipping point. So at age 27, players' performance on average tends to slip off. So if we're talking about players that are, remember the average was over 30, so they're already on the downside of their career. So, a one-year contract certainly makes sense. The second column is the division between one-way and two-way contracts. So oftentimes what you're really auditioning for is not an NHL contract, but for a minor league contract. And for more experienced players, it's always surprised me how relatively decent the compensation is for players on two-way contracts once they're, through their entry-level contract. It's not at all unusual to see salary levels at the minor league level of $200,000, $300,000, $400,000. And of course, if it's a one-way contract, they're going to get at least $1 million because that's now the league minimum, and they might even get more than that. The average AHL salary for this group was $222,000. The range was $45,000, but that was back in 2015. You wouldn't see that nowadays. And the highest level was $700,000. So if we can just move to the next slide. This looks at the minor league salaries for players who signed two-way contracts. And of course, if you were on a one-way contract and you were assigned to the minors, you would get your NHL salary, whatever that happens to be, as provided for in your contract. But for the most part, we can see that these salaries are within a relatively narrow band. There are a couple of players up here that signed for pretty high numbers at the minor league level. The highest was a player named Andy Green. Some of you may know him. He was at $700,000. Michael Roosevelt was at $600,000. So if we can move to the next slide here. These are the unadjusted salaries. So again, at the very high level, you've got a player here. This is Mike Hoffman, who following the PTO signed a contract that would pay him $4 million. Andy Green was at $2.7 million. But if we move to the next slide, because the salary cap changes every year and the minimum salary changes every year, if you sign a contract to play in the NHL, whether it's a one-way or two-way contract, at the NHL level, you must get at least the league minimum, and that has varied over time. So over the course of this database, starting in 2015, the league minimum was $575,000 US. To last season, the league minimum was $750,000 US. So in order to sort of equalize all of the observations, these data points simply represent a multiplier of the league minimum. So you can compare any year one year to another, kind of an apples to apples comparison, because you're simply comparing the multiplier. And when you look at, so one would be your salary is the league minimum for whatever year that you were playing. And you can see here that overwhelmingly, this basically is one. Everybody's signing for league minimum. So, you know, you're taking that risk. You show up for training camp, you're not getting paid anything, you're hoping that you're going to be able to earn a contract. And if you are able to earn a contract, with very, very few exceptions, you're going to get a one-year deal at league minimum. Now, what I'm going to continue to do is to look at the post experience of these players, like what happens after the PTO, which might be interesting. Are they able to, is this their last hurrah in the NHL? Is this their last hurrah in terms of professional hockey at all? I know I was looking at some of the players. A lot of them end up going to play in Europe, actually, quite a few. So this is their last year in the NHL, but then they can go play in Europe. I do have some friends who played in Europe, and of course it varies dramatically, but it's still not a bad deal. Most players, you know, that have a decent NHL resume, they can earn $300,000-$400,000 in Europe. Usually the team will cover all of their living expenses and travel expenses. It may be a good way to end their career because it's, I think, generally accepted, a less rigorous experience for players. There are fewer games, larger rinks, you know, less hitting, you know, those sorts of things. But that's something that has to be looked at, and I will continue to do that. So if we can move to the last slide. And now, am I good with my time here? Yeah. This is my last slide. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to talk about it. So this is an interesting provision in the collective bargaining agreement. It's a kind of arrangement that you often don't see in other professional sports, where you can actually sign a player to an agreement without any sort of reciprocal contractual obligations at all. I mean, even if I sign a PTO, I'm not even guaranteed that I'm going to play in preseason games. I mean, it probably will, because the team wants to audition me and see if I'm good enough, but, you know, I'm basically taking a lot of risk. The club isn't really absorbing much of a risk other than some pretty modest expenses that they're going to have to cover, and, you know, maybe an insurance benefit or a medical expense. So it's a pretty risk-free opportunity for the teams to evaluate players without committing to a contract. For players, obviously no one has signed them. You know, if they'd signed a professional contract, they wouldn't be allowed to sign a PTO because their property rights would be held by some other club. Even outside the NHL, even in Europe, you wouldn't. The rules of the IIHF, they respect contracts in all professional hockey leagues across the board. So it's a player completely without a contract. I'm 30, you know, 28, am I going to get another opportunity to play? It's either a PTO or nothing. You know, I'll take my chances. I'll try to sign with a team where I think my skill set might, you know, work in terms of finding a position. If it doesn't, maybe some other team will pick me up. Even if I'm not going to be able to secure a standard player's contract in the National Hockey League, maybe teams in Europe or elsewhere can, you know, look at my tape and see how I performed, and that might be an opportunity for me to secure a position. The odds are not that bad. You know, recently you've got about a 40% chance of signing an NHL contract, and it's probably going to be just a one-year agreement. It's a 50-50 proposition as to whether it'll be a one-way or a two-way. But even if it's a two-way contract, as the data shows, the minor league salaries are not that bad. They're not $70,000 like a player on an entry-level contract. They're probably going to be in the $200,000 range, which, you know, not too bad. A lot of people in this room would probably say, I'll take that.
I'll take it. Sign me up.
So there we are, the PTO.
Thank you. Question, Tim. Do you want to handle questions or something?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, if we've got time. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a very good presentation, actually. I had a lot of questions and you answered all of them.
Well, that's not very Very good.
One question that comes to mind is, as you were doing this research, did you come across either a statistic or a specific case where you were really surprised? I did not expect that sort of situation or that statistic.
Well, I guess the biggest one was the Mike Hoffman deal. I mean, and he ended up signing a pretty decent contract, but when he signs a contract for $4 million, you sort of wonder, why didn't he get a contract before that? And of course, there's always these dynamics. You know, a player may overvalue their worth. Teams may be wanting to sign a player, but you know, there's that 50 contract limit, and there's also a salary cap issue. And as I said before, it's become increasingly difficult to move contracts in the NHL. More and more we see teams have to retain salary. Teams have to sit on a player for a while because they don't have the room, and they're going to have to find a way to create that space. You know, earlier this morning I was talking with one of our colleagues here about the complexity of the staff of an NHL team now. A friend of mine, he was on the staff of the Vancouver Canucks, a lawyer, and his sole job was basically managing some of the intricacies of the collective bargaining agreement in terms of making sure you're salary cap compliant and all the exceptions. You know, when a player goes on injury, how does that affect the salary cap? If we're going to trade, how do we create that room? You know, and accounting. You know, when players, most people don't realize, but when you're on the road and you're playing in American cities, those players actually pay income tax in many American cities, and so that has to be managed by the club, and they try to manage that in a way to minimize the amount of taxes that are going to be paid. When trades are made, you know, the NHL is a very international league. I don't know how many nationalities might be in the league, but I'm guessing it's 15 or 20. You know, there's visa issues, and you know, with Russia now, I mean, I'm still surprised that all the Russian players are still playing in the National Hockey League. I was kind of surprised that there wasn't some political movement around, you know, their work permits and that sort of thing. You know, it's an extremely complicated thing that the casual fan just doesn't see. But you know, managing an NHL hockey club nowadays it's not just, you know, going out and hiring talent. It's fitting the right talent into a salary cap world, and on and populating an NHL team, populating a minor league team, and all the considerations that go around with that. So it's a complex business. It's a very complex business.